Lesson 4 of hormonal communication is on thermoregulation. Looking at our specification, we're going to be looking at the physiological and behavioural responses involved in temperature control of ectotherms and endotherms, looking at peripheral temperature receptors, the role of the hypothalamus and effectors in skin and muscle, behavioural responses, and in ectotherms we'll be looking at behavioural responses. So it makes sense to start with a few key terms. Endotherms are animals which primarily produce their own heat, so that's organisms that can maintain their own body temperature. Ectotherms are animals which mostly get their own heat through the environment, so those would be quite often what we refer to as cold-blooded. We come across these terms as well. Homeotherms, that means they have a constant body temperature, and poikilotherms are animals whose body temperature adjusts according to their environment. Again, those terms we often refer to homeotherms as being warm-blooded, and poikilotherms are often referred to as being cold-blooded. We don't use those terms in our exams though. Hyperthermia, where the temperature drops too low for metabolic activity, that's which would be anything lower really than 37 degrees C. Now that doesn't mean that all metabolic activity stops, it just means it slows down, and it could slow down to the point where it's actually really quite dangerous. Hyperthermia, where the temperature rises too high for metabolic activity, and this is also dangerous because enzymes could be denatured, and very, very high temperatures can be fatal. So starting with poikilothermy, poikilotherms are organisms which make no attempt to control their internal body temperature. Or the other possibility is that they do control their body temperature to some kind of limited extent, but aren't able to stop it fluctuating as the environment around them changes. So examples of this would be including things like fish, and we've got some lizards here, insects, most things which are invertebrates would be poikilotherms. So what is the general link then between body temperature and activity level? Well, hopefully you will all be able to recognise that if you are more active, this is going to generate some excess energy which is generally lost as heat. So the more active you are, the warmer you will be. And obviously this is a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation, because very cold environments can limit activity, which then means that there's no excess heat to keep themselves warm. So we've got some examples here of poikilotherms. All of these animals are poikilotherms, yet they can control their body temperature to some degree. So I want you just to think for a moment on how they might be able to do that. Now, they cannot control their body temperature by internal mechanisms, so they must have other ways of doing it. Now, in amongst this poikilotherms, we have this terminology of ectothermy. These are reptiles and insects. They will obtain all their heat from external sources, which is obviously most likely to be the sun, and they attempt to maintain their constant body temperature by behavioural means as well. So that comes back to what we were talking about in the previous slide. So although these animals really rely on their environment for their heat, they do assist the situation by actually doing things that will moderate their body temperature by either warming themselves up or cooling themselves down. A good example here will be the marine iguanas. Now, you might have seen this on a video about the Galapagos Islands. These are iguanas which bask on a stone, but then need to actually feed or graze on algae which is on the seabed. So these marine iguanas warm themselves up to as warm as they can by sunbathing on warm stones, and then they dive into the sea, feed for as long as possible, and as their temperature gets down to the point where they can no longer really operate, they surface and then go back up onto the rocks and so on. So they actually regulate their environment by their behaviour. So here we got some of these ones here swimming, and then some other ones that are just sitting on the rocks. And here we have some other animals which are changing their behaviour in order to moderate their body temperature. So for example, at the top there we've got a lizard which is hiding in a shady area while the sun is really, really hot outside. We've got this probably crocodile sitting in some water to try and keep his temperature from getting too hot, and this one down at the bottom is sitting with his mouth open so that this can allow water to evaporate off the surface of his mouth, because there's nowhere else that the animal can sweat. So we go on to homeothermy. Homeotherms are animals which are able to maintain a constant body temperature regardless of their ambient temperature. Now I'm going to give you a couple of unusual examples first. So both of these of course are reptiles, and reptiles are not considered to be homeotherms in the true sense of the word, the way that we think of them. They actually have no mechanism to maintain their body temperature in the way that mammals do, but they're referred to as inertial homeotherms. They're ectotherms. They rely upon their environment around them to control their temperature, but they actually control their internal temperature by their behaviour and also by the nature of their enormous size. So these are called inertial homeotherms, which basically means that they manage to keep their body temperature up by sitting in the sun, gaining a lot of sun, and their bodies are so big that they can store quite a lot of their energy from the sun, and that heat loss is relatively low because their surface area is relatively low compared to the volume of their tissues inside. So if you were a really small organism like an insect, or perhaps maybe a very small frog, you would relatively have a lot more surface area to volume. So this wouldn't be a strategy that would be able to work for you. But because both of these reptiles are fairly big, they have quite a lot of mass in their bodies relative to their surface area, although obviously the snake has a larger surface area than the crocodile, they can manage to use this strategy to keep themselves relatively warm without there being huge fluctuations of their body temperature. Now most homeotherms use endothermy as their means of keeping their body temperature the same. So endotherms obtain their body heat from respiration. This will use a range of different physiological and behavioural mechanisms to supplement that activity to control their body temperature within very narrow limits. So here are some key adaptations of endotherms. Animals need to use a range of different options, and we're going to run through what they are in just a moment, but all of these adaptations are either structural or physiological or behavioural, and you can see examples of each of those on these pictures. So the first one is insulation. Now insulation is a means of retaining the heat that's being produced. So most organisms do that in a couple of ways. Firstly, by having a distribution of body fat or adipose tissue. That's quite often under the skin and also around the organs. It's the body fat around the skin particularly which is involved in keeping body temperature up, and the stuff around organs is usually more of a protective role. The other possibility is feathers and fur. So we've got examples there with the bird and obviously with the cat. So mammals have a lot of fur, but obviously birds have feathers. And fur and feathers will only be effective as insulators if they're kept waterproof. So we've got the feathers here on both of these birds, and what they will do is they will be secreting oils from the skin beneath, and those oils will coat the feathers and give them a waterproof coating. And the same thing happens on animals, particularly animals that are living in water. The hairs are covered with an oily substance which provides quite a lot of protection from the water, and in fact some of them, for example like otters, they have such a thick coat and so much oil in that coat that the skin itself isn't actually wet when they're in the water. Now the other thing that can happen is that feathers and hairs can be raised, and that increases the amount of air that's trapped next to the skin. So when you fluff up your feathers or your hair stands up on end, what it's actually doing is it's creating more space for air to come into contact with your skin. That air warms up and it's then held underneath that layer of feathers and hair to keep yourself as warm as possible. So it actually reduces the amount of heat that's being lost to the air around it, which I know sometimes sounds like it shouldn't make sense, but actually what you've actually got is you've got a layer of warm air around your skin, so that your skin is not coming into direct contact with really cold air around it. Here's an interesting example. We've got penguins' feet. Now penguins spend most of their time standing on ice. If we stood on ice for months on end, our feet would get frostbite. But also, as the blood was flowing through our feet back up to our bodies, our core temperature would drop. That very cold blood that's coming from those feet would gradually cause, over time, a reduction in the core temperature inside the body. And if you kept doing that, eventually you would get cold. We all know this. If we're standing outside on a very cold field, maybe watching some rugby or something like that, when we stand there for long periods of time not actually moving, our feet get really cold, which is why we always wear thick socks and boots. If we were just standing there on our bare feet, then gradually our feet would become really, really cold, and we would feel cold as well. And that's basically because the blood coming from our feet is cooling the interior of our body. This doesn't happen to penguins. Penguins can stand on cold surfaces for months on end and be completely fine. Now obviously their feet are cold, but they do still need a blood supply. But what they don't want is they don't want that blood supply to go back into the body and cool everything down. So there's a book that actually covers this, Why Don't Penguins' Feet Actually Freeze? So you might want to have a look at it. It's a New Scientist production, but it gives you answers to this and a range of other questions, but I'll answer it for you right now. So this explains how they do it. They have a countercurrent heat exchanger in their feet, just like the flippers of a dolphin do. So if we look at this diagram, what we can see is we have venous blood and arterial blood, and they are blood vessels lying right next to each other inside the structure. So the arterial blood brings in warm blood from the body core, and that's running next to the venous blood, which is bringing the cooled blood from the tip of the flipper back up. And as they run so close together, the warmth from the arterial blood is transferred into the venous blood, so that by the time the blood gets back into the main body, it's already warmed back up again. And though the tip of the flipper obviously will be very cold, just like the tip of the penguin's feet, it won't freeze the feet, freeze the body as it goes back in. And we see the same thing with birds that swim in very, very cold waters as well. The same situation can be observed in reindeer noses. If you live in a very cold environment, every time you breathe out, you're losing some of your body heat to the environment, and as you breathe back in, you're bringing very cold air into your body. So the lung tissue could effectively be a place where you lose a lot of your body heat, and draw a lot of cold air into the body, which therefore needs to be warmed up. But what happens in this case is the animals that are living in these cold environments, for example reindeers, have noses full of blood vessels, and these cool the warm air down as it leaves the body, so it draws some of the heat back out so that you don't lose all the heat into the environment, and warms up the air as it comes in. And that keeps the reindeer's brain warm and active, but also keeps the body core temperature up. And there you can see a thermo imaging there, which shows the nose being really warm compared to the rest of the body. So we're going to have a look at some of the physiological mechanisms of temperature control. And to do this, we need to go back to looking at the brain, and we are back to looking at the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is the part of the brain which monitors the blood temperature, and as we know, it does a lot of other things as well. There's a region in the hypothalamus called the thermoregulatory centre, and what this does is it monitors the temperature of the blood as the blood flows through. Any deviations from 37 degrees C for a human will stimulate a response. Homeotherms will then manage to keep their body temperature fluctuating around this optimum, which of course is part of homeostasis. So thermoregulation then is therefore controlled by negative feedback. And we've got a diagram here showing the different sides of the system which are working together to maintain a body temperature. So sensors detect the changes in body temperature through stimuli, so nerve endings in the skin, and other sensors which are sending information to the brain telling you about the core temperature. and the effectors bringing about a response. So this is the peripheral nervous system identifying that the body temperature is changing, and then this information is coordinated in the central nervous system by the hypothalamus, and it tells effectors what to do to actually change the body temperature to either warm yourself up or cool yourself down. So if we look through mammalian skin, here's a diagram showing skin. We've already looked at this before, but skin plays a really important role in thermoregulation, and it does a number of things. So the hypothalamus will send messages to the skin, and within the skin there are various tissues which are going to respond. So various muscles under the skin, blood vessels and glands. So we're really seeing how the central nervous system sends nerve messages to a range of effectors which will then respond to whatever conditions the body is going through. One of the biggest contributions is the way in which the blood flow changes to the skin, and this is by these two processes of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. You probably come across them at GCSE. So vasoconstriction is when blood is diverted away from the skin surface. So we can see we've got a little capillary network there, and blood is now not flowing as much through that little capillary network on the left, because there are shunt muscles which are actually tightening and constricting around those capillaries and directing blood mostly down through that main arteriole and actually not allowing it to go through to the surface of the skin. And as blood is not going to the surface of the skin, it's going to retain some of its heat, and don't forget that a lot of the body heat is circulated in the blood. On the right we've got vasodilation, and this is where those capillaries are being opened up, so the smooth muscle around those capillaries is being relaxed, and the blood is now flowing much more through those capillaries, and so that allows the blood vessels to be filled with blood. The blood is now going to flow closer to the surface of the skin, and that allows more heat to be transferred into the atmosphere by radiation, convection and conduction. And of course, one thing you have to be careful of is that you don't talk about the blood vessels themselves moving, it's just the quantity of blood flowing through them that's actually changing. This also results, of course, in a person having a much redder skin, so when they're been exercising, maybe on a hot day, they have a really red face and red arms and so on. So another physiological adaptation is the ability to sweat. Now the skin of course has sweat glands, and those sweat glands are stimulated when you're really hot, and that then allows water to be secreted onto the surface of the skin, and it uses some of the heat from the blood to evaporate, and as it does so that cools you down. If you can't sweat because you're in a very humid environment, you will feel a lot hotter and therefore a lot more uncomfortable. A humid environment is where there's a lot of water in the air already, so it's very difficult for water to evaporate, so you will feel sticky and sweaty in a humid environment. The other two animals here, we've got the tiger and this bird of prey, both of them are unable to sweat because they don't have skin which allows that to happen. There's no sweat glands close that are exposed because they've got feathers or fur over their surface. So what they tend to do is pant, and that allows water to evaporate off the mouth. So we've got large numbers of blood vessels there, so it takes away some of the heat from the body. Of course, if you get too cold, then another option is to shiver, and that often is something that happens when we get too cold. We notice ourselves shivering, and this is a message from the hypothalamus to the muscles which are lying underneath the skin, and it tells them to contract in a rhythmic fashion, which is the shivering, and also you can also see it the same. You might have things like goosebumps as well, which causes the hairs to stand up on end, which is also a response to the cold. And this shivering releases a little bit of heat. So anytime muscles contract, one of the byproducts of that contraction is energy from respiration, which cannot be used for the contraction process, and so it's lost as heat. So whenever we exercise, we'll always feel warm because some of that heat is given off. Changes in metabolic rate result in changes in the amount of heat generated by respiration. So if we look here, we've got a diagram which shows us the thyroid gland, which is on the front of the trachea, and the metabolic rate is controlled by a hormone produced from the thyroid gland called thyroxine. And thyroxine effectively controls the basal metabolic rate, which is how much energy you're using just to stay alive. So this is the amount of energy that's required just to keep everything ticking over, your brain working, your heart beating, breathing, and just basic activities. And if you have a lot more thyroxine, it will increase your basal metabolic rate, so you will use up more energy than somebody with a low metabolic rate, which is obviously one of the things people try to use as an example for why they might be putting on a lot of weight. And it does obviously occur for some people. So what would happen if the thyroxine levels of a body temperature is too high? What effect would this have on a person? Well, the obvious thing here is that if somebody has very raised thyroxine levels, they will use up more energy, they'll produce more heat than they would normally experience, but therefore they might also feel very tired because they would actually be really running out of energy a lot more quickly. So let's look at hypothermia. Now, hypothermia occurs when the core body temperature falls below its optimum, and as a result the hypothalamus will trigger off mechanisms which reduce heat loss or increase heat generation, and of course both of them probably happening at the same time. So the first thing is to try and increase the amount of heat that the body's generating by shivering and increasing metabolic rate by perhaps getting up and moving around, that type of thing. The other possibility is to try and reduce the amount of heat that's being lost. So the hairs on your skin will start to stand up on end, you get goosebumps, vasoconstriction occurs, so we reduce the flow of blood to the skin, and decreased amount of sweat. Also very important is behavioural adaptations. When an organism gets cold, they will usually respond by doing something about it, maybe huddling and getting into groups with other members of their species, maybe moving into the sun so that you actually try and warm yourself up. You might sit differently, so you might sort of like get into a little ball to try and reduce the amount of heat that your body is losing. All these things are quite natural responses to feeling a little bit cold. And of course humans could put on more clothes as well, so there's a number of things that organisms do in response to hypothermia. Now, when hypothermia occurs in humans, if the temperature falls below 35 degrees, this becomes very serious because quite a lot of these responses stop happening. So a person stops shivering and they don't necessarily have goosebumps. They also stop being able to make decisions for themselves because the hypothermia starts to affect the brain. And the person perhaps doesn't recognise what's going on. They tend to sit still, they become less active, and people die quite quickly from hypothermia when that happens. It takes a little bit of time as well for the core temperature to be raised when somebody has actually gone into hypothermia. So this takes us on to hyperthermia. This occurs in the opposite direction when the body temperature goes above its optimum. This then triggers the hypothalamus, which sets off some mechanisms which will increase heat loss and decrease heat generation. So we won't shiver, we might decrease our metabolic rate by perhaps being quite inactive and maybe feeling quite lethargic. We will also increase the heat loss by having the hairs flat to our skin, having a lot of vasodilation, so it might look a bit red, and also we might be sweating or panting if that's the sort of animal that does that. So all of those things increase the amount of heat that can be lost by water taking away that heat with it. And finally, of course, behavioural adaptations, where you might go and find a cooler environment to sit in some water. Lots of animals go and find a pool to sit in if they're too hot, or find some shade. Anything like that might also help to reduce your temperature. And again, one of the areas of the body that's most badly affected by hypothermia is the brain. So it's really important to keep body temperature around 37. Once you get over 40 degrees, the brain starts to be really affected and people can become delirious and are able to sort of make decisions for themselves in a similar way as hypothermia. So one last point is the role of hibernation. Now we've got some examples here of animals that are hibernating, some snakes and this dormouse. And one of the things that they have in common is that most mammals that hibernate are small. So the reason for this is that if you're small, you have a relatively large surface area to volume ratio, which means that you have a lot of ways in which you're losing heat to the environment. Now when it's a warm day, that isn't such a problem because you won't lose very much heat. But if it's very cold, you're going to lose a lot of your body heat to the air around. And that means that you're going to need a lot of food to fuel that. So if you are something like a dormouse, the chances are in winter there's probably less food about and the temperature is a lot colder, so getting out and about and trying to provide enough food to keep yourself warm would actually be more difficult than just being able to just try and sleep through it. So all these mammals like dormice and hedgehogs and so on, what they do is they store as much food as they can as fat in the body and try to sleep their way through the winter, and so when the weather gets a bit better they can then come back out and get on with it. And in order to do that they have to really reduce their rate of respiration, and one of the things that they do is that they have to decline their heart rate to about 1 beat per minute, and in this case dropped down to about 4 degrees C, whereas a dormouse would naturally have a heartbeat that would be well over 100 beats per minute, probably more like 200. I'd like you to just copy out this table and try and fill it in, please, with the advantages and disadvantages of being an ectotherm and an endotherm. And for this I want you to think a bit about what I've just been talking about in terms of the energy requirements of keeping your body temperature constant and the effort that you need to go through to do that, and how much energy you're going to need and how efficient that is, and also relative to things like your body size and so on. And that brings me to the end of this PowerPoint on thermoregulation, and I'd like you now to have a look at some of the questions which I'm going to be giving you to do, which are from past paper questions. Thank you very much, everybody.